Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, in which we'll be looking at provider governance reforms. My name is Janet Anderson, and I am the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. I'm chairing today's event. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting right the way around Australia, and paying my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples watching today. The key topics we're going to cover in today's webinar are to provide an overview of the provider governance reforms, to give you a sense, if you don't know it already, of the implementation dates and who these reforms apply to, and then sketch out for you the determinations process for providers not in a position to meet the requirements. And then we're going to close with a really interesting piece on the Governing for Reform in Aged Care program and how you can access it to support your organisation in lifting your clinical and organisational capability, governance capability. Now, joining me for today's discussion are two members of the Commission, Louise Macleod, the Complaints Commissioner, and Pam Christie, who is our Executive Director of Strategic Projects. And Donna Lester, another senior member of the team, is with us to assist us with answering questions. So before I hand over to Louise and Pam, who are going to do the heavy lifting, I just want to provide a bit of context for the discussion we're going to have today. Now, it's self-evident, but nonetheless worth repeating, that any organisation needs the right people in positions of influence in order to be successful. And providers of aged care are certainly no different in that respect. The right mix of people in an organisation is a key factor in providing strong leadership, in exercising oversight, ensuring accountability, driving continuous improvement. And in our sector, it's absolutely essential to ensure the delivery of high quality and safe care and services. Now, the legislation was amended late last year to strengthen the governance arrangements of approved providers. And those changes were designed to improve accountability and transparency, support diversity, and also expand the expertise that aged care providers have access to in performing their governance roles. The strengthening of governance that's provided for in the legislation is designed to be implemented over a 12-month period. Some of the changes commenced from 1st of December last year, and the balance of them, and particularly in relation to ongoing providers who had approval to operate prior to December last year, those changes commenced on 1 December this year, 2023. Now, Louise Macleod is going to run through the specifics of those requirements shortly, but I wanted to explain what we're seeking to do today. An important part of the Commission's role is to ensure that you as providers are well informed about the change requirements and so are well placed to be able to comply with them. So part of our responsibilities as the national regulator is to support you to understand what is required of you, what is expected of you as providers. We will hold you to account for your performance against your legal obligations and also the way in which you seek to identify and mitigate risk of harm to consumers. Part of that responsibility is ensuring that we as a Commission are making available to you and pointing you in the direction of the necessary guidance, advice, education and resources so that you can school yourselves on those expectations and then make really well-informed decisions about the actions you're going to take to ensure that you are fit for purpose, that you are operating in accordance with the law, and that you are all the while keeping the consumer at the centre of the picture and doing the right thing by them. Now, the preparations that I hope you are all well advanced in making for the governance arrangements which commence from 1st of December this year have been available for a while. And as I say, I certainly hope you and your teams have taken the opportunity to familiarise yourself with those obligations and to start the process of reviewing your policies, your procedures, your practices, the way in which you operate in order that you can comply from the 1st of December this year. And our role is to ensure that you're familiar with those obligations so that you're not taken by surprise. Before I hand over to Louise, a bit of housekeeping. You can ask questions at any time by clicking on the blue raised hand icon towards the top of your screen. We will be sharing the presentation slides from today's session with everyone who registered. And during the presentation, I'm advised that you can make the slides full screen by hovering your cursor over the slides. You'll see a square icon in the top right-hand corner, which, if you click on it, will increase the size of the slides, and you can click on it again to resume the normal dimensions. There is a short survey at the end of today's webinar, which I encourage you to complete, please. It provides us with feedback as to how you found the webinar, the content, the relevance. We use it, we look at it closely, and it informs our way forward in the judgments and choices we make about what else to share with you and how. So if you stay on at the end of the webinar, you will be taken automatically to that survey. Now, I'm pleased to invite Louise to speak to all of us about the governing body requirements and the other reforms to be introduced from 1st of December this year. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks, Janet, and good afternoon, everyone. So, as you would know, the Royal Commission recognised that the governing body of an aged care approved provider plays a critical role in ensuring that consumers receive safe and quality care and services. The provider governance reforms introduced in December 2022 strengthen and complement the responsibilities providers already have. And those responsibilities are reflected in Standard 8 of the quality standards. So that responsibility to deliver safe and quality care and services. Now, from December, the 1st of December 2022, all providers must be meeting the reporting obligations for material changes. So, for example, a change in key personnel or the subcontracting out of care services. If you're a corporation, this includes the obligation of your key personnel to notify you of changes to their suitability to remain in that role. Providers also must assess the suitability of your key personnel at least once a year and report to the Commission on your operations through an annual statement. Now, from the 1st of December 2023, these obligations will expand, and all approved providers must also ensure that your governing body has a majority of independent non-executive members and must have at least one member with experience providing clinical care. You must establish and continually operate a quality care advisory body. You must offer consumers and their representatives the opportunity to establish one or more consumer advisory bodies. You must ensure your staff are skilled and are building on your service capability. And lastly, you must prioritise older Australians if your organisation is a wholly owned subsidiary of another body corporate. Now, for those providers who were approved after the 1st of December 2022, you must meet all the provider governance requirements from the date of your approval. I'd now like to focus on the responsibilities you have about material changes and key personnel notifications. It's important that you tell us when you make changes to your organisation that affect how you operate. And this includes any structural changes, business decisions about the sale of part or of all of your company, mergers and acquisitions, even if there's a consolidation within a related company. And also when you sell or transfer a service to another approved provider, including to a related company. You must also tell us when your key personnel change, so when you add or remove individuals. It's also helpful to tell us when your key personnel change roles, so that we can keep your approved provider record updated. So for example, when your general manager people and culture moves into the general manager operations role. You also, when you email your material or key personnel change notification to us, you need to attach documents about the change, including police and bankruptcy checks for each individual. Now, your notification will be invalid if you submit an incomplete notice, use an old form, or don't attach the required documents. Now, there are currently delays in updating approved provider and key personnel records because many of the notifications we are receiving are invalid. At the moment, as we're all adjusting to these changes, our team is needing to go back to providers several times before we get complete information that can be recorded. We've also had some providers already raise concerns with us about privacy. Now, the Commission takes ICT security and privacy very seriously, and we've taken appropriate steps to ensure that emails we receive that contain sensitive documents are safe and secure. We use a secure internet and email gateway for the receipt of emails, which has been independently security assessed to hold and process information that is personal and sensitive. We're also working hard with the Department of Health and Aged Care to make sure that the Government Provider Management System, or GPMS, supports you to meet your notification responsibilities for material changes, the key personnel changes, and key personnel suitability. We have been listening to the feedback given to us, and we are using that feedback to ensure that gaps are being identified and efficiency solutions are being developed. And we will let you know when we are close to deploying the new online notification submission function. But please make sure you are subscribed to the Commission's Quality Bulletin. Now, governing body composition requirements are that a provider's governing body must have a majority of independent non-executive members and at least one member with experience providing clinical care. Now, you don't have to meet these requirements if the governing body has fewer than 5 members and provides aged care through one or more services to fewer than 40 care recipients, or you're an Aboriginal community controlled organisation, or you're a provider who is a state or territory or local government authority. Now, for the purposes of today, I'm going to refer to the above, what I've just described as exemption criteria. So unless you meet one of the exemption criteria, the governing body composition reforms will apply in their entirety to all approved providers from the 1st of December this year. Now, we understand there will be circumstances where a provider would not meet the exemption criteria and cannot meet a governance responsibility. For example, when the provider is in a remote or rural area and is having difficulty finding independent, non-executive people to join their governing body. In these situations, the Aged Care Act allows a provider to apply for a determination from the Commissioner. So what is a determination? This is the outcome of a decision affirming that either or both governance responsibilities do not apply. Now, to request a determination, approved providers must complete the application form, which is now available on our website. And you can scan the QR code that is currently showing on the slide. That will take you directly to our Request a Determination page. Please carefully read the information on this web page. It contains some helpful guidance and frequently asked questions, which we're reviewing and updating on a regular basis based on the feedback we are already receiving from providers. You can also email us at agedcarereform@agedcarequality.gov.au with questions that we will respond to and then update the FAQs. All right, Now, there are several factors the Commissioner may consider when deciding whether to issue a determination to an approved provider. These include, but they're not limited to, the number of services the provider has, the number of care recipients in those services, the location of the services, the membership of the governing body, and what other measures the provider will take to meet the requirements in other ways, for example, sourcing clinical care advice when needed. Now, the application form will ask you to provide information that addresses these matters. So how will we assess your application? We will review your application on all the attachments to assess that the measures you are implementing to ensure objective decision making that considers the best interests of care recipients. We'll look at the current membership of your governing body and what attempts you have made to recruit appropriate members. We'll also look at whether there is any risk to care recipients if your application to be exempt is approved. And we'll also look at how the quality of care will be maintained in the absence of the governance requirements. We'll also look at records that we hold about you here at the Commission, for example, complaints data, serious incident notifications data, site visits and quality assessments, and financial and prudential information. Further information about the assessment process is on our website, and I encourage you to read the website content. And if you have any questions, please get in touch. We are happy to help you. Please note that if the application form is incomplete or missing the supporting documentation, we won't be able to progress it. This includes if the name and signature of the governing body person authorised to request the determination is missing. Now, approved providers who apply for a determination will be notified of the outcome within 60 days from the time you receive an email from the Commission that your application is complete. The decision time frame can be delayed if we need further information from you to finalise the assessment. And we will always talk about this with you and tell you the revised time frame. Where we do decide to approve a provider's application, you will receive an email that will specify the date the decision was made, which membership requirement, for example, the majority, non-executive members and/or clinical experience decision relates to, and the length of time the determination decision is in force for. Where there is a decision not to approve a provider's application, you will receive a notice of the decision of the non-approval, including a statement of reasons which will specify why the application was not approved, what your review rights are, and how to apply for a reconsideration of the process and the decision. Now, the maximum determination decision is 12 months, and this should allow enough time for an approved provider to explore other options to meet the governing body requirements. However, there are where circumstances require it, a new request for a determination can be submitted to the Commission. And please remember that if the Commissioner makes a determination about one or both governing body responsibilities, all the other obligations under the Aged Care Act, including those we are covering today, still apply. Now, to give you a sort of a practical sense of the governing body reforms, we've prepared some scenarios for you today, and there are others on our website as well, which I encourage you to read. So the first scenario, Provider A is an organisation with only 3 people on its board. However, it provides care to more than 50 aged care residents. Do they need to comply with the governing body requirements, or are they exempt? The short answer is yes. In this case, the Commission would consider that the organisation is not exempt. This is because Section 63(1)(d) subsection 3 of the Act provides that the governing responsibilities do not apply to an approved provider where the governing body has fewer than 5 members and provides aged care services to fewer than 40 care recipients. So this means the Act requires a provider to satisfy both conditions at the same time for the provision to apply. However, if the organisation believes that there are other circumstances present that may impede your ability to meet the governing body responsibilities, you can choose to apply to the Commission for a determination under section 63(1)(e) of the Act that either one or both membership responsibilities do not apply in respect of the governing body. All right, scenario 2. So provider B is a small organisation that provides only one service and is in a remote or rural area. And this has made it difficult for provider B to find people locally to satisfy the governing body requirements. Do they need to meet the requirements, or are there other options available to assist provider B? Now, I have mentioned before that we understand that some providers may face challenges in meeting one or both of the governing body membership requirements and might need extra time to achieve compliance. And we know it can be difficult for providers operating care services in a rural or remote area to attract and retain skilled staff with clinical care experience. And it might also be costly or challenging to find suitable independent non-executive members. We encourage providers to investigate options that could be considered satisfactory, and potential options could include using technology such as Zoom or MS Teams to allow members from neighbouring towns or medical practices to remotely participate in your governing body meetings. You could share your governance documents through secure cloud-based services for review and discussion by remotely located members. You could work with other approved providers who are nearby or even interstate who may be facing similar circumstances, and create a network of similar organisations who could work together with you to find a solution that is mutually beneficial. And if you have explored and tested all different options but are still unable to meet the governing body membership requirement, you can apply for a determination. All right, last scenario. Provider C is a home care provider that doesn't deliver clinical care. In this instance, why do they need to have a clinical care representative on their governing body? Now, the requirement to have a member of a governing body with experience providing clinical care also applies to providers of home care, residential care, transition care, and multi-purpose services. So, for example, if you deliver social support services as an approved provider of home care, the requirement still applies. If you also deliver services under the Commonwealth Home Support Program, this requirement does not apply to those services, only to the home care services. It's important to remember that even if you do not deliver clinical care or nursing services, there is likely to be some component of clinical care oversight applicable to your service. Now, an example that comes to mind is in the delivery of personal care. A support worker who attends a home to assist a care recipient to shower may find that the care recipient has a wound that is currently being treated by their GP. And we expect that the approved provider has appropriate decision-making processes in place to ensure that appropriate care is still being delivered even on a short-term basis. So having a clinical care representative as part of the governing body will help ensure that those short or even medium-term care needs are being supported. And while having a governing board member with clinical experience is a requirement, the nature of the clinical experience is not prescribed. This means each governing body can appoint a member with experience most relevant to the nature of the provider's services. And on that note, I will now hand back to Janet and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Louise. Well done. All right. I'm going to broach a couple of questions now, and then we'll move to the second part of the webinar, which is Pam Christie telling us about the Governing for Reform in Aged Care program. Louise, let's get to the nub of it. Now, you addressed a range of different obligations or responsibilities that are currently attach or will attach to providers. And I just want to distill the essence of that for everyone watching. Let's go to the membership responsibilities of governing bodies. Now, these are twofold. Essentially, they are that the governing body must have a majority of independent non-executive members, one. And the second arm is that they must have at least one member with experience in the provision of clinical care. Majority of independent non-executive members, one member with experience in provision of clinical care. Then you went on to talk about the determination process, and you used as an alternative word for today, the exemption process. Now, there are some conditions or criteria which would enable a provider to be automatically exempt from those requirements, and they pertain to, and you mentioned this, organisations which have 5 or fewer board members and, not all, but and 40 or fewer care recipients. And if they meet both of those criteria, then they are automatically exempt. But you mentioned another category of determinations. I wonder whether you could just step us through that again, because there may be a number of providers online who have more than 5 board members and or more than 40 care recipients, but who nonetheless consider that they may want to approach us for consideration of this exemption. Can you step us through that, please?
Yeah, sure. So there are 2 other, I suppose, elements. If you're an Aboriginal community controlled organisation, or you are a state or territory or a local government authority providing care, then you don't need to meet the requirements. However, there is the ability in all other circumstances under the Act to request a determination of the Commissioner. And it allows the Commissioner, basically to take into account the impact on you. But it is a discretionary, I suppose, aspect of the Commissioner's role to determine or to consider the impact that it might have you and your experience and the difficulty or you may experience in meeting those requirements. But you need to be able to demonstrate that. And it ties back in with what I said earlier around when we are assessing your application, we would need, the Commissioner would need to be, we would be looking at what attempts you've made to recruit appropriate members, what is the current membership of your governing body, how the quality of care will be maintained in the absence of the governance requirements. So all of that can be taken into account by the Commissioner.
Thank you. One more question for now, possibly, and it goes to what we consider to be relevant clinical experience for governing bodies. We often get that question. It is a requirement in the Act now that governing bodies have this individual. And so providers approach us and say, well, what would you consider would be relevant? Do you want to take that one up?
Sure. So again, it ties into the service that is being provided. And there are other, I suppose, there's other clinical experience that might be relevant. So for example, if the service that you are providing to the care recipients is around physiotherapy, for example, then the clinical representation on your governing body might be better having that aligned with physiotherapy than having a general practitioner, for example. So it does allow for recognition of, they're not prescribed, and it allows for recognition of, I suppose, the full spectrum of clinical care and experience that might be available and provided by your service.
All right. I did say that was the last question, but another one's come in, which I think would be worth picking up. Where can I find someone to join my governing body? And this is a question we get sometimes from those services further away from metropolitan centres, and I think it's one worth picking up as well, because you don't necessarily have to draw from a local pool, although that's clearly desirable. Louise?
Yeah, look, another good question. I can understand why you threw it at me. I would encourage providers to be a bit creative. I think I mentioned in the presentation a bit earlier that there might be people, particularly if you're in a remote and regional area, there might be people outside your immediate township who could make themselves available to assist you, whether or not it's in terms of meeting the independent member, or who are able to meet the limb around clinical care. There might also be opportunities to engage with other providers and look at how you can pool resources together. I am wondering whether ACPA may be of assistance here, and that's probably something we need to take away and have a conversation with ACPA about. But I definitely think there are options if you think outside the box a bit.
Good on you. All right. Thank you. We'll draw a close to Louise's session there, although there may be more questions when we're in the Q&A session properly. I'm going to move on to Pam. Now, Pam's going to talk to us about governing for reform in aged care, what's coming up, the resources available, and how the program can help you to prepare for the new obligations commencing 1st of December. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you, Janet, and I'm really pleased to be joining today's webinar. The Governing for Reform program, hopefully you've heard about it, and many of you will already be enrolled in the program, but there are so many opportunities to engage in different learning activities. What I wanted to do today was sort of give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of our more popular learning activities, but also talk a little bit about the background of the program and where we're going from now on, how the program's transitioning next year to a wider audience. Now, Louise has already talked to you about the Royal Commission, and of course the Royal Commission found that effective leadership and governance was absolutely critical for quality and safe care. So we believe lifting, not just understanding obligations or understanding compliance, but lifting the capability, both organisational and clinical governance capability of your whole team, of your leadership team, which includes your governing body members, is absolutely critical to support your organisation to be successful and to deliver high quality care. Even within the Commission's regulatory regime, we found that effective governance systems is a high area of non-compliance. In fact, in our most recent sector performance report for home care providers, it was the most common area of non-compliance. And similarly for residential, it was the second most common area of non-compliance after personal and clinical care. So we were very pleased when the government read the final report of the Royal Commission and invested in lifting the capability of the sector. And this is absolutely what this program aims to achieve. I'll talk just very briefly about the design of the program. We we took the 4 critical behavioural shifts that the Royal Commission identified. That's what the Royal Commission report said, that in order to be effective in leadership and governance, providers needed to focus more on older Australians in the centre of everything they do. They needed to understand their obligations and accountabilities. They found in many instances this was not well understood, particularly by governing board members. The whole issue of knowledge, skills and experience in aged care, we know that many board members may not have come from the sector and commonly don't understand how the sector operates or what are some of the, as for example, clinical governance expertise we've just been talking about. And finally, the leadership and culture that was needed to achieve the ambitious shifts to quality and safe care right across the sector. So what the Governing for Reform program does is take those 4 behavioural shifts and basically maps all of our learning activities to one or more of those shifts. So I'll talk a little bit more now about some of the activities, but an important design principle that we grappled with when developing the program was how could you deliver a training program that was going to meet the needs of such a very wide and diverse range of participants, because we have everything from very large organisations delivering nationally to smaller, rural, remote, and the sophistication, I guess, and the capability of those organisations is going to vary very enormously. We also learnt from our early research into the needs of the sector was that all governing bodies and leaders were time poor in the sector and feeling overwhelmed by the pace and the range of reforms that they were facing. So the program is very much to assist and help and guide, but be flexible enough that as a participant, you can find what you need at the right time and engage in that learning. So to run through a few of the activities, we have 17 online learning modules, and they're available at any time for participants to access. And each of those learning modules has a flip guide, which is an easy printable summary of the modules. So it's like you can use it as a refresher or a summary of what the key elements of the module are, and a toolkit. And the one thing about the toolkit that I really want to emphasise is that there are lots of practical tools. So if you're looking at your capability, for example, of your governing body, and you want to look at the skill matrix, well, there's a template that you can download from the toolkit and use to review the capability of your own governing body. So as well as the online resources, we have monthly webinars. Now, last week we had a webinar on clinical governance for non-clinical leaders, and it was hugely popular, and it really broke down some of the myths, I think, about talking about clinical governance when you're not a clinician. And we record the webinars and encourage people, if you don't have time to watch them, to have a look at them later. Our podcast series has been very, very popular. We make that podcast series available on open podcast platforms. So if you're a podcast listener, and we know many people in the sector like to listen to podcasts, we found out from our research on a Friday evening or afternoon and a Sunday are the most popular times, that maybe when people are driving or doing some chores, to listen to a podcast. And we've got a new podcast series being released very soon, and that will include some consumer voices, and we're very excited about that. We have currently, I think, around 6,500 downloads of our podcast, so we know that's one of our most popular activities. The workshops are more hands-on, if you like. They're facilitated workshops, but you get to learn with providers across the sector. And we refresh the topics of the workshop depending on both feedback from participants and some of the current issues that are in the sector. Action learning groups are what they described. It's you get together with some like-minded leaders and you choose your own topic of what you want to discuss, and there's some facilitation and support for you during that process. And lastly, we have leadership sprints for the big end of town where the larger providers can choose a topic, a wicked problem perhaps that their organisation is facing, and provide some facilitated discussion. And we also have coaching for smaller providers, rural, remote, called providers. So I guess we like to think there's something there for everyone, and you can engage in learning, how you wish to do, whatever your preferred learning style. I'll just share one more activity that's been particularly popular. We recognise that there are a lot of individuals that have been part of the program, and that's great that they can enhance their capability as individual leaders, but we also saw the value of group learning. So where a whole board or a whole executive team could get together and do some joint activities where they could all not only learn more, but relate that learning specifically to their organisation. So we developed the For the Board kit. 12 discussion topics are on your screen. We've done an extra 13th topic on infection prevention and control. So there's actually 13 topics now available. And it is, a very practical template board paper that you can adjust and amend and put your own data or your own relevant information and share with your board. And then the paper also links to other learning activities that you might want to engage in to go deeper. So compliance with clinical governance obligations has been a popular one, as has the workforce retention, which we know is an issue that's impacting across the sector. So just to finish up, we'll look at the enrolments, where we are at the moment. Over 6,000 enrolments. We've been very, very pleased with the popularity of the program, but there's still an opportunity to enrol and engage in the learning activities. You can see on the right-hand side, we've engaged quite deeply in the sector, but there's always more providers to reach out to. From next year, we'll be making the learning resources from the program and some of the learning activities more widely available, and they will be on the Commission website and Commission learning platform, Alice. But if you're not already enrolled, I really encourage you to take advantage of this innovative and flexible learning program. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Janet.
That's just as well, because I have some. Thank you, Pam. Pam, let's begin where you left off. Enrolment. So it's not too late to enrol in Governing for Reform?
No, not at all. Enrolments are open to governing body members and executives of both home care and residential aged care providers. We have, and that's what the program targets, because that's what we were funded to target that group. We have had feedback that more people want to access some of the learning resources, and as I mentioned, from next year they'll be freely available on our website, so anyone can go and access the resources. But also, as I mentioned, if you go to the Governing for Reform website, the address that's on the screen now, you will find that some like the For the Board kit is accessible there for anyone without actually being enrolled in the program.
So, Pam, the value of these programs is often determined by the perception and the experience of the users. And I know that we have sought and made good use of feedback. Can you share some of that feedback with us and the ways in which we've harnessed it to ensure that we're meeting the market, as it were?
Yes, sure. So each of the learning activities has a feedback form. So we take that feedback very seriously. Some of our learning modules initially were hard to navigate, not hard to navigate, but the feedback was from some learners that because they're flexible, they weren't quite sure whether they'd completed all of the module or not. So we take that feedback very seriously. But as part of the program, we've also had surveys, done some interviews, and there will be next year an independent external evaluation of the program as well. So we're continuing to learn and continuing to understand from providers what works best for them. I'll give you one more example. I think when we looked at the coaching sessions where we have much up-close engagement with providers, that issue about being time poor just came through so strongly. And, there was a willingness and an interest to learn, but just no time. So I think that's where we realised we had to get a lot more innovative, and things like the podcasts that you can listen to at any time, or having a lot of the learning activities just available for when people were ready to engage was the way to go.
I know we've had some really good feedback about the For the Board kit. And I know we also included information on infection prevention control more recently. Can you just elaborate a bit on what is available through those resources, just to whet the appetite of anyone who may not have yet signed up?
Yes, well, I'll go back to the 12 topics that were on the screen. I don't know if we can navigate back to them, but they were topics that came from the sector. So we engaged with the sector and said, what are the most critical issues facing your organisation in the context of the aged care reforms? So there's one on incident reporting. There's one on workforce retention. Yes, IPC was a new one that we put in. There's one on risk. So they're all the topics that boards want to engage in, but they weren't just theoretical. The papers are practical, because the paper invites you to, for example, with the workforce retention, to actually look at the data of your own organisation. What is your workforce retention rate, and what are your current strategies, and how can they be strengthened, and where to go for some further information. So it's really the practical nature of that I think was what drove us to listen to that feedback and try and make the material as relevant as possible. Okay,
thank you very much. All right, let's move to general Q&A, and thank you to everyone who has submitted questions. Keep them coming. Some really important ones here. Louise, I'm going to come to you, although Donna may also be available to take some of these. We've had questions in relation to the governance obligations and whether they apply to CHSP providers, Commonwealth Home Support Program providers. Now, my understanding is that the obligations apply to approved providers, and it is a feature of our Act that CHSP service providers are not approved in that formal legal sense. Have I got that right? CHSP providers are actually out of scope for these specific obligations in relation to the constitution of the governing body?
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, that's my understanding. They're not captured by the governance obligations.
Okay. And so a Meals on Wheels service that somebody has asked specifically, see if I can find it. Tom wants to understand whether Meals on Wheels is in scope. If it's delivered as a CHSP grant-funded service, then you are not obliged to adhere to these provisions. The other point I'd make is if that is a service which is operated by a local council, they also are outside the scope of these requirements. So on both those counts, you are not obliged. Having said that, though, and Louise, I'll invite you back in here as well. These are useful principles that the independence or the independent voice around the governing body table inevitably adds value, because it's not party to any of the implementation, or it doesn't have a mere suggestion of conflict of or even any interest as a skin in the game. So there is virtue in that, and also the opportunity to draw someone into decision making with clinical experience can add value too, even if that's not a requirement which is placed upon you by virtue of your participation in the sector. Louise, any observations on that?
Yeah, Janet, that's a really good point. I think throughout the course of my career, I've always seen the richness that can come from diversity in decision making. So I'm a big one on collective intelligence. So, our society and our workplaces are made up of lots of different people with different backgrounds, experience, different age, and so forth. And when you bring everyone like that together to help you problem solve and try to work through issues that require a decision, my experience has been that the decisions that are ultimately made when you draw on all of those different perspectives and the diversity, they are a lot more robust and rich and reflective of ethical considerations, what is good value, best practice, that type of thing. So I agree with you, Janet. I think getting people in to challenge thinking is a good thing.
Okay. Brian has asked about remuneration of independent governing body members and whether that's feasible. Now, the answer is it is a matter for the approved provider and their decision. But I would caution, in other words, there's no barrier to making payment to governing body members, and it does not necessarily impact their independence, the perception or the fact of their independence. However, it would be in the approved provider's interests to be really clear that any payment that's made to any governing body member is not to and cannot be regarded as influencing their voice, their views, their decisions, their critique, or any of their contributions to the organisation. So there's no proscription as such, and I am sure that there are arrangements in approved providers around Australia where governing body members, board members are remunerated for their services, and there needs to be clarity around the distinction between receiving a payment for doing your job as a board member and holding that organisation to account, providing very strong, clear-eyed leadership for the executive of that organisation and ensuring accountability. Louise, anything to add there?
Yeah, again, Janet, I agree with what you've outlined there. I think at the end of the day, perhaps it's about the pub test. If you have got independent members on the governing body and they are involved in decision making, reflecting on, and they are being remunerated, just reflecting on what that may look like from outside looking in, and ensuring that you've got appropriate governance mechanism in place to, create that independent decision-making environment.
Okay. Pam, a couple of easy ones for you. What is the podcast series title? Kelly wants to know. I think you've got a new listener.
A Governing for Reform. If you go to your whatever you listen to podcasts through Google or Spotify and just type in Governing for Reform and it will come up, and you can choose whichever podcast you'd like to listen to.
Excellent.
You can also find a bit more information about the podcasts on the website address.
And you're allowed to listen to all of them. Pam, another one for you. Leanne wants to know whether or where they can get access to the board kit.
Well, again, that's if you go to that web address that's on the screen, gfr.hcarequality.gov.au, you can download the board kit directly from the website. You do not need to be enrolled in the program to access that kit.
Brilliant. That's great. That is advice that is available on our website, but we probably need to highlight that because I think some people might consider that enrolment is necessary, but as Pam has just outlined, it is not.
Well, same for the podcast. Anyone can listen to the podcast.
Yeah, and highly recommended, of course. Louise, final question for you before we close. We've been asked by Tracy whether the governing body member with clinical experience could be a nurse working in the same organisation. Now, my understanding again is that there's no rule that says they can't be, but again, there would be certain expectations you would place on that individual because you would have them on the board for a particular reason, wouldn't you?
Yeah, yes, that's right, Janet. So there's no reason why they can't be, because the clinical person doesn't, under the Act, doesn't need to be the independent or one of the independent members. But again, for when you're thinking about how the decisions are made, and again, think about it from those looking outside in, the involvement of a nurse, probably, yep, great, but just be careful around your governance processes and making sure that there's no undue influence there, but definitely worthwhile having that experience on the governing board.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. A few closing remarks, if I may. We know the centrality of organisational governance and strong leadership to workplace culture. And culture is where safe quality care is landed. It is the interaction between the older person receiving care and the aged care workers, your staff, who are going to make the difference. It's not the regulator, and it's probably not even the employer, the approved provider. It is actually on the ground. It is the interaction between the care worker and the consumer of care. And the leadership and the accountability exercised from the top of the organisation is instrumental in delivering the best outcomes at that consumer interface. Don't convince yourself otherwise. What we saw again and again through the height of the pandemic was that those organisations which were least well placed to cope with the additional pressure and stresses that emerged as outbreaks threatened were those organisations where the leadership was fragile, where people on the board possibly weren't paying enough attention, didn't have quite the right skill set, hadn't looked at the capabilities they needed to develop and exercise, which were going to provide the leadership for everyone in that organisation experiencing those sort of pressures. So please think about it in that nested way. Organisational governance, which is provided assertively and creatively and with a very strong sense of the mission and vision of the organisation from the very top, from the governing body. These new obligations are designed to strengthen your hand. They are designed to enable you to shine and to provide the leadership that your organisation needs and that your workers are looking for, which will enable them to deliver the experience of aged care that consumers have a right to expect. So, quick reminder that there's a survey at the end and you'll be taken to it immediately on completion of this webinar. Please fill it out. As I said earlier, we're very keen to hear your voice, to hear from you what works for you, what didn't work as well for you that we can avoid next time, and so that we are constantly dealing with the sort of resources that are going to assist you in getting things right, in fulfilling your obligations, managing risk, and delivering the best possible experience. I hope we have cleared up some of the questions you had. My thanks to Louise and Pam for their sterling work in covering so much information so efficiently. And thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.